The wind moaned across the Wyoming plains like a beast in mourning, flattening tall grass beneath a bruised sky. Spring of 1879 came not with warmth, but with thunderheads that churned like war drums above the ridge. Rain slashed sideways against old timber and the cracked windows of a lone ranch house on the edge of Fort Griffin. Inside the lean-to shed, Silas Boone worked a bridle strap by lantern-light leather between his calloused hands, needle-stitching in steady rhythm. The hiss of a kettle echoed from inside, and the fire in the hearth snapped like dry bones. Silas wasn't a man who welcomed visitors. He had built his life on solitude, the kind that no longer hurt, because it had become part of him. Out here, no one came unless they were lost or dangerous. So, when 3 quiet knocks came at the cabin door, sharp, quick, and uncertain, he stilled. His hands paused, mid-stitch eyes narrowing. He set the leather strap down, rose from his stool, and stepped with heavy, deliberate boots toward the door. The wind howled harder, as if trying to keep him inside. When he opened the door, rain clawed its way into the room. Standing on the porch, shivering and soaked to the bone, was a boy no older than 7. Barefoot mud to his knees, his cheeks hollow with hunger and cold. A battered hat sagged on his head, nearly hiding his eyes that were far too old for his face. Silas didn't speak right away. The boy did. "Sir," he said, just above a whisper. "My mama's in the woods. They're coming back tonight. If you don't help her, they'll kill her." Silas studied the boy silently. His left hand twitched toward the coat hook where his old oilskin hung beside the Winchester that had kept wolves, both the 4-legged and 2-legged kind, at bay for years. "What's your name?" Silas asked. The boy hesitated. "Daniel," he said, then added, "Mama's name is Alara. But my aunt used to call her something else. I think it was Naya. She said it when she brushed Mama's hair at night." That name pierced Silas like a bullet. His breath caught, but his face remained still. "Naya," he repeated quietly. It was a name he had buried 5 years ago with the woman he had loved and lost during a bloody skirmish between settlers and native warriors. He had never spoken it since. He thought the memory had died with her. But now it was rising again in the form of a half-starved boy standing on his porch, whispering about killers in the trees. "Get in," Silas finally said. The boy didn't hesitate. He stepped into the warmth trembling, but too proud to collapse. Silas handed him a tin cup of hot water laced with honey and wrapped a thick wool blanket around his shoulders. As the boy drank, Silas locked the doors and checked the windows, his instincts awake now. Something was wrong, deeply, urgently wrong. "Tell me again," he said. "Who's after your mama?" Daniel's eyes darted to the window as though he expected shadows to materialize from the rain. Men with torches. One of them wears a badge, but he's not a real lawman. Mama said if something happened, I had to run. So I ran. Silas paced the floor. His heart, which had been silent for years, now thumped like it remembered what it was made for. The boy wasn't lying. He could feel it. A portrait hung over the hearth, an oil painting of a dark-haired woman with a sad smile. Daniel pointed at it. "She looks like Mama," he said. "Kind, but sadder." Silas didn't answer. Couldn't. He looked away, jaw tight. "Her name again?" he asked. "Ilara. But Auntie used to say Naya." Silas stepped back as if the room had tilted beneath his boots. That name, that face, that ache in his gut, he couldn't deny it. He reached for the rifle on the mantel. The oak stock fit his palm like it always had. Cold, solid, familiar. "I'm taking you back," he said. Daniel looked up. "Even if it's dangerous. Especially then." He pulled on the oilskin coat, strapped the rifle to his back, and yanked the door open. The storm lashed at them, but Silas didn't flinch. He turned to the boy. "Stay close," and Daniel did. They disappeared into the darkness, two figures swallowed by rain and wind and past regrets. The woods waited, and somewhere in them a woman long thought dead held on to her last breath, unaware that salvation had just walked out of the storm with a rifle, and an old wound reopened. They moved fast, following faint deer trails and game paths the lantern Silas carried, throwing long, jagged shadows through the trees. The wind tugged at their clothes like a warning. Daniel led without fear, his small boots slipping in the mud, but he never stopped. "She hides in a ravine," he said, breathless. "Old dry wash. She's hurt. I think she can't walk." Silas grunted. Every sound in the trees felt sharper now, the snap of branches, the rustle of leaves. And as they neared a ridge cloaked in mist, Daniel pointed. There. They approached slowly. The ravine was barely visible, shielded by thick brush and a rock overhang. Silas raised the rifle, moving silently. A flash of movement. He stepped forward, heart in his throat. Lightning cracked overhead, turning the forest white. That's when he saw her. Curled beneath the rocks, wrapped in wet blankets, lay a woman, face pale, bleeding from the leg, barely breathing. Her eyes opened. Silas. He froze. It was her. The storm had brought her back. Silas hadn't heard that voice in 5 years. Not in dreams, not in waking memory, not even in the fevered half-thoughts that come during illness or long rides under the sun. But now it rang out through the storm, cracked and weak, yet undeniable. "Alara," he breathed as if saying her name might shatter her like glass. She tried to sit up, her face streaked with mud, her lips pale. A crude bandage wrapped her thigh where blood still seeped slowly into the fabric. Her body trembled more from exhaustion than cold. "Don't move," Silas said, finally pulling his breath back into his chest. "You're bleeding." I thought she coughed, grimaced. "I thought you were dead." He nodded once. "So did I. About you." Behind him, Daniel stood silent, eyes wide as he watched the strange, powerful moment unfold. Silas turned back to the woman he once believed buried in a burned-out village. She wasn't a ghost. She was real, and she was in danger. Without another word, Silas bent down, sliding one arm behind her back and another beneath her knees. She weighed next to nothing. When he lifted her, her hand clutched weakly at his coat. Whether for balance or from emotion, he didn't know. They moved quickly, Silas leading the boy and carrying Alara through the trees and back toward the ranch. The trail was muddier now, harder to follow, but he knew the shortcuts, knew how to vanish into the land. When they reached the cabin, the storm hadn't lessened, but its violence had dulled to a steady, mournful weep. Inside, Silas laid her gently on the cot beside the fire. The boy peeled off his soaked clothes and wrapped himself in the same blanket as before, curling up on the floor near the hearth, a child too tired to cry anymore. Silas fetched a basin of warm water and a roll of linen he hadn't used since he stitched up his own shoulder after a buffalo gored him. He worked with the calm precision of a man who understood pain. Alara never made a sound as he cleaned the gash on her thigh and stitched it closed. When it was done, he sat back in the chair by the window, his rifle across his lap. The fire threw shadows up the wall behind her, dancing around the portrait that still hung above the mantel, the one that used to be her sister. Alara turned her face toward it. "She looks older in that painting," she said softly. "She was," Silas replied. "It was the last thing I had of her. I wasn't sure you'd recognize me," she whispered. "I wasn't sure I'd believe it was real." They sat in silence for a long while, the only sound, the slow, rhythmic cracking of logs in the hearth and the distant patter of rain on the roof. Then Alara reached beneath the quilt and pulled something from her wrist, a silver bracelet, thin and etched with twin feather motifs. Silas's eyes locked on it. He reached into the drawer by the fireplace, withdrew a cloth bundle and slowly unwrapped its contents, an identical bracelet untouched since the day he found it after the village burned. He laid it beside hers on the small table between them. Alara's voice broke. She gave it to me that night, told me to run to carry something that mattered. I waited for her, 2 days, but no one came. Silas stared at the fire jaw clenched. She saved you. She always did. He couldn't speak. The pain, the years, the guilt, it flooded back, but not like a tidal wave. This time it was a slow surge creeping through the cracks he'd tried to seal with silence and distance. Daniel stirred beside the fire, but didn't wake. The boy was deep in sleep trust, clinging to his breath. Silas finally asked, "He's not yours." Alara shook her head. His mother was a friend, a healer. She died during the spring rains. Fever. I buried her with my own hands. And his father, she hesitated, wore a blue uniform. I never knew his name. Silas nodded slowly, the weight of the world pressing down again. The world doesn't want his kind. Not yet. No, she agreed, but I couldn't leave him. I tried. He followed me anyway. And now he's the reason I opened that door. They both looked at the boy curled into the blanket. His face was softer in sleep, free of the sharp edges life had already begun to carve into him. I'm not her, Alara set eyes on Silas now, but I still carry what she left behind. He studied her long and hard. You carry more than that. Alara stood and limped to the fire, kneeling slowly beside it. She fed in another log, coaxed the flame higher. Her fingers moved the way Naya's once had careful, deliberate tender. Later that night, while Daniel slept and Alara rested on the cot, Silas stood outside the cabin watching the dark line of trees across the prairie. The storm had passed, but he could feel something worse coming. The past hadn't returned just to remind him what he lost. It had come to ask if he was ready to protect what might still be saved. The cabin smelled of pine smoke, damp wool, and something long-forgotten comfort. Morning came with a dull gray sky, the sun hidden behind mist that clung to the hills like a ghost that refused to leave. Silas boiled water over the fire, the metallic hiss of the kettle filling the silence. He moved with purpose, but without haste, like every action was a decision he had to weigh first. Across the room, Alara sat propped up on the cot. Silas's flannel shirt draped loosely over her frame, sleeves rolled to her elbows. Her leg was stiff wrapped tight in linen, but she showed no complaint. Her dark hair had been brushed back, tied into a simple braid. She was no longer the half-conscious woman he had carried in from the woods, but neither was she the woman he remembered. "You slept a little," she said, noticing the heaviness in his step. "Hard to rest," Silas replied, "when you've forgotten how." The boy, Daniel, was still curled near the fire blanket pulled over his shoulder. His breaths came deep and even peaceful in a way only a child untouched by the dawn could be. Alara stirred the coals with an iron poker, coaxing life from them. Her movements were efficient, almost habitual, like she'd lived this way for a long time. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of something held back too long. "They found me in the rocks. I was hiding, just like she told me, after the raid." Silas didn't respond, just watched her from his seat at the table. They weren't soldiers, not really. White men with guns, torches, looking for someone to blame. I guess I looked enough like one of them to be useful. His jaw tightened. They kept me for days. Wouldn't say why. I think they thought I was valuable trade bait, maybe. Or worse. She paused. I escaped one night. Crawled through the dark until my hands bled. Didn't stop until I hit the river. After that, I kept moving. Didn't belong anywhere. Silas poured her a cup of warm water, set it on the table. She didn't touch it. I found Daniel a few weeks later. His mother had just died. Fever from the rains. He was alone, scared. I tried to walk away. But you didn't, Silas said. She looked up. No, I couldn't. There was something in the quiet that followed a tenderness wrapped in exhaustion. Neither of them dared call it hope, not yet. That afternoon, while Daniel helped gather kindling near the woodshed, Silas watched from under the porch eaves. Alara knelt beside the boy, showing him how to strike flint against steel. Her hand guided his small wrist, gentle but firm. The spark caught. Daniel let out a quiet cheer. She smiled, brushing his hair behind his ear. Her fingers lingered a little longer, a soft, motherly instinct. Silas felt something stir deep in his chest, something warm and unfamiliar. It wasn't desire or nostalgia, it was recognition. The way her fingers moved the tilt of her head, it was care. Not survival, not reflex. Real care. Real love. He stepped back into the shadows, needing the privacy to understand what had just bloomed inside him. That night, as rain returned in soft drops tapping against the windows, they sat by the fire while Daniel slept. Alara stitched a tear in her coat. Silas sat at the table, not reading, not carving, just thinking. "You're not her," he said quietly, almost to himself. She looked up, startled. "But you have her fire." Alara didn't answer right away. Then she nodded. "We shared a womb. Some things stay." Silas didn't smile, but he didn't look away either. That was enough for her. By midday, the next day, the air had shifted. The wind had grown still too still. Silas was splitting wood near the barn when he heard it hoofbeats slow and deliberate. He dropped the axe and stepped out into the clearing. 3 men rode up the hill toward the cabin. They wore mismatched uniforms, half military, half county law, but none of them carried themselves like men bound by honor. The leader was a thick-set man with a crooked brass badge pinned to his coat. His hat sat low on his brow, shadowing small, mean eyes. "You Silas Boone," he called. "Been a while since anyone asked," Silas said evenly. "Depends who's looking." The man dismounted, spitting tobacco into the dirt. "You rode patrol out this way back in '72. Folks remember. I remember dust and vultures." The second man, younger, more eager, spoke up. "We're looking for a woman. Native, slim, traveling with a boy." Silas crossed his arms. "Why?" "She's wanted, aiding the death of a scout. The boy's considered dangerous." Silas blinked. A 7-year-old. He bit a corporal, drew blood. Silas didn't smile. "That'll leave a scar." The lead rider stepped forward. "Mind if we look around?" "I do," Silas said, tone flat. "You hiding something?" "I value my privacy. That's still legal." The younger one circled toward the well. Silas followed, heart beginning to race. Then he saw it, a single footprint in the mud. Small, fresh, too small to be his. Panic flared. Inside the barn, beneath layers of hay and burlap, Alara and Daniel lay silent. He had shoved them in moments before the riders arrived. The soldier crouched by the well. "You got kids here?" "No." "Then what the hell is this?" Silas stepped beside him, kettle in hand. Rain leaves prints, even old ones. The man narrowed his eyes. Then, as if summoned by instinct, Silas let out a sharp yelp and stumbled forward. The kettle tipped. Scalding water splashed onto his boot. "Damn it," he cursed, staggering back, clutching his leg. The distraction worked. The soldiers rushed to him. The footprint was forgotten. "You all right?" one asked. "I've had worse," Silas growled, grimacing. "But it ain't fun." A few minutes later, after more empty threats and sideways glances, the men mounted up. "If you see anything," the leader said, "send word." "I'll let the wind know," Silas replied. They rode off. Silas leaned against the porch post, breath shallow, heart pounding. Inside the barn, Alara placed a hand on Daniel's back. He looked up at her with wide, wondering eyes. He didn't say anything, but he didn't have to. That evening, the storm broke for good. The clouds peeled away, leaving a sky so wide it made a man feel small. Silas sat on the porch, his foot wrapped in a bandage, steam still rising faintly from the burn on his ankle. The kettle stunt had worked, but it left a mark, one he'd carry for a while. Inside, the cabin had returned to its quiet rhythm. The fire cracked gently in the hearth, casting flickering gold against the wooden walls. Alara brought him a fresh mug of water and leaned on the doorframe beside him. "You burned yourself," she said, soft but certain. Silas didn't look at her. Could have been worse. She hesitated, then sat beside him. "You did it for us." He met her eyes. "I did it because I hate men with torches knocking on doors." Her lips curled just a little. Not a smile exactly, but close. They watched Daniel in the field. He chased a grasshopper through the tall grass, stumbling, laughing as it leapt ahead of him. For a moment, he looked like any other child untouched by fear. "You ever wonder," Silas asked, voice low, "if there's a place where he could grow up not being hunted?" Alara watched her boy. "I think we have to build it, one choice at a time." Silas nodded. "Well," he muttered, glancing down at his burned foot, "that's one hell of a first brick." That night, with stars scattered over the prairie like forgotten lanterns, the cabin held a strange stillness. Alara packed in silence. She moved methodically, folding a blanket, tucking dried food into bundles, tying her flint pouch tight. Silas watched from his chair near the fire, knife in hand, carving notches into a pine block. One for each year since the village burned, since Naya vanished, since he'd closed his heart to everything except the work of survival. He didn't speak until she reached for her satchel. "So you're leaving," he said, not looking up. "Yes, before dawn." She nodded. "They'll come back. I won't let them hurt you. Not again." Silas finally turned to face her. "You think I'm doing this for you?" She stopped, hands at her sides. "No, I think you're the kind of man who'd burn his foot to protect a stranger. That kind of man doesn't stay safe long." He stood slowly, setting the knife down on the table. His shoulders were stiff, not just from age or injury, but from the burden of everything unsaid. "And the boy," Alara stepped closer. "He'll be safer with me. If we move fast, stay low, we can reach the southern border." Silas crossed the room, eyes dark. "And what then? You teach him to run forever." "I teach him to live," she said. Her voice was calm, but carried a quiet force. "I've lived too long in other people's homes, Silas. I don't want to turn yours into a battlefield." He opened his mouth, then closed it. Instead, he walked outside. The night air was cold biting, but he needed it. Needed something cleaner than the war still spinning behind his eyes. That's when he saw them. Behind the barn, by the old chopping block, Alara sat with Daniel. A lantern glowed softly at their feet. She held a potato in one hand and a knife in the other, guiding his hands around the blade. Not too tight, she whispered. Let the blade do the work. Daniel concentrated, tongue peeking from the corner of his mouth. The potato skin curled away in a perfect ribbon. He grinned with pride. "Good," she said, brushing the hair from his forehead. "You're strong, but careful. That's a good thing to be." Silas stood in the shadows, unmoving. It wasn't just the way she taught him. It was the way she watched him, proud, patient, present. It was the way Naya used to teach Silas all those years ago during their first winter together, when the world still felt full of new beginnings. This wasn't memory. It wasn't ghost. It was real. and it broke something loose inside him that had been locked away too long. He stepped forward. Elara looked up, startled. He said nothing, just sat beside them. Daniel held out the knife. "Want to try?" Silas took it, smiling despite himself. Been a while. The three of them peeled quietly under the stars. Later inside, Silas leaned near the hearth while Elara finished tying up her pack. He stared at the fire, then at her, then back again. "You don't have to go," he said. She didn't look up. He tried again. Not because of the past, not because of her. His voice lowered. "Because of what's in front of me now." She turned slowly. Their eyes met. "I see you," he said. "Not her shadow. You." Elara's breath hitched. Her eyes filled, but didn't spill. He reached into the drawer, pulled out an old folded map, and spread it across the table. The lines were faded, but he traced one with his finger. "There's a trail south," he said. "Hidden. Steep but clear. If we leave before sunrise, we might outrun them." "You'd leave everything?" she asked. He looked around. The cabin, the worn saddle, the empty spot above the mantel where the portrait once hung. "I already have." She placed her hand over his on the map. Fingers brushed. Soft, intentional. "Then let's go," she whispered. It wasn't desperation. It wasn't duty. It was a choice. Born of something delicate but unshakable. The first light of dawn crept over the hills when they slipped from the cabin. Elara rode behind Silas on his old mare, holding Daniel tight. They followed the trail into the narrow pass into wind and pine and risk. But this time they weren't running from something. The path south curved through a jagged canyon where the wind moaned like old spirits trapped in stone. Silas knew it from his patrol days, an old miner's trail barely wide enough for a single horse. The granite cliffs loomed on either side, cold and pale in the early morning light. Elara sat behind him on the saddle arms wrapped around Daniel, who leaned into her chest, silent and still. By midday, shafts of sunlight cut through the rock walls in narrow beams. The canyon quieted, but Silas didn't relax. His eyes kept scanning the ridgelines above them. Something felt wrong. He tugged the reins, bringing the horse to a stop near a shaded alcove. A thin stream trickled nearby, and they dismounted to water the horse and rest. Silas crouched beside a boulder eyes on the horizon, while Elara dipped her hands in the stream. "Too quiet," she said. Silas nodded. His hand drifted toward the rifle strapped to the saddle. Then it happened. A crack, sharp, metallic. Stone exploded inches from Elara's feet. "Riders," Silas barked. Elara grabbed Daniel and dove for cover as another gunshot echoed off the canyon walls. The horse reared, panicked, but Silas held the reins tight, guiding them behind a rock outcrop. 3 men descended from the ridge above, rifles drawn. The crooked badge on the lead rider's coat glinted in the sun. "You're running with fugitives now, Boone," he called. Silas didn't answer. He scanned the path ahead, tight curve, loose gravel, a steep drop. Then his memory lit up. Half a mile ahead, there was a slide path. One he'd used once to trap a horse thief. He'd rigged it years ago, just in case. He turned to Elara. "We have to move? Now." She looked at the bend, then at him. "Can we outrun them? We can outsmart them." They mounted, quickly, Daniel clinging tight. Bullets chased them as they galloped down the trail. One ricocheted off the cliff face. Another sliced the air beside Elara's head. She leaned forward, covering Daniel with her body. "There," Silas shouted, pointing above a narrow bend. "That shelf." The riders were gaining. He pulled hard to the left, veering off the path. "Take Daniel. Ride east." "I won't leave you," she cried. "You have to, or he won't make it." His eyes locked with hers. "Go." Tears sprang to her eyes, but she nodded, turned the horse, and galloped down a different path with Daniel tucked beneath her arm. Silas scrambled up the shale slope boots, slipping fingers scraping stone. Gunshots rang out behind him. He reached the ridge, two posts buried beneath Rock's rope still intact. He yanked it. The mountain groaned, and then it collapsed. A wall of boulders and dust crashed down the trail behind him, sealing the canyon. Horses screamed. 2 riders were thrown. One man rolled clear just in time, coughing, buried up to his chest in rubble. Silas turned to run, and fire bloomed through his shoulder. The bullet spun him, and he dropped to his knees. Pain roared through his side like a lightning strike. He pressed his hand to the wound. Hot blood soaked his shirt. "Alara," he gasped. Down below, she saw the dust cloud, heard the shot. She didn't hesitate. She wheeled the horse around and rode hard back up the path. "Elijah!" she screamed. Daniel held her tighter, eyes wide with fear. Silas was dragging himself across the rocks when they reached him. His face was pale, jaw clenched against the pain. "You're hit," she said. "I've got another arm," he muttered. "Help me up." Together, they hoisted him onto the saddle. Ilara climbed behind Daniel in front. She held Silas tight against her, her forehead pressed to his back as they rode, pushing the horse as hard as it could go. By nightfall, they crossed into the borderlands. The land opened wide, tall grass, swaying in the breeze, pine trees standing like sentinels along the riverbank. The air smelled clean, alive, safe. Silas slumped in the saddle breath, shallow eyes half-lidded. Ilara held him closer. "Why'd you come back?" he asked, voice raspy. "You were worth the bullet." He chuckled, once coughed. "Can't argue with that." They reached the edge of a town, just as the last light faded. It was small, barely more than a smudge on the edge of the desert. Adobe buildings huddled together, warm and quiet. No signs, no soldiers, no questions. They dismounted outside the livery stable. The owner didn't ask their names, just nodded and pointed toward the back stall. Inside, Silas collapsed onto a stack of hay. Ilara cleaned the wound again, whispering soft words Daniel couldn't hear. They didn't speak of the men behind them. They didn't speak of what they'd lost. They only looked at what they had: a boy curled against a saddlebag, a man bleeding but breathing, a woman who never thought she'd find solid ground again, and the beginning of something not just new but theirs. The town had no name on any map, just a word-of-mouth kind of place, the kind that existed because people needed somewhere to begin again. Dust swirled soft beneath wagon wheels. The sun baked the adobe walls until they glowed amber at dusk, and in the middle of it all stood a crooked fence surrounding a small livery stable where Silas Boone leaned against a post, saddle oil on his hands, a quiet ache still lingering in his shoulder. He moved slower now, careful with his arm, but the pain had faded into a dull song, one that didn't bother him when he saw Daniel running across the yard, laughter in his throat. The boy's bare feet kicked up clouds of dust as he chased another child past the single-room schoolhouse. At the doorway stood Ilara, her skirt dusted with chalk, her eyes brighter than he had ever seen them. She'd taken a job teaching just 3 weeks after they arrived. Somehow, the townsfolk hadn't asked much. Maybe they saw what Silas did, a woman who didn't need forgiveness, only the space to keep going. Ilara saw Silas watching her and smiled. He smiled back without thinking. Later, inside the stable office, the light dimmed to orange as the sun dipped low. Silas sat at the rough wooden desk he'd built with his own hands. From the drawer he pulled out an old envelope, creased, yellowed, still sealed. His name was written across the front in his own handwriting. He'd penned it after the fire, after the raid, but never found the strength to send it anywhere. He opened the flap, unfolded the letter. "Dear Naya." He read aloud, voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know where you are. Maybe nowhere. Maybe just inside the part of me that still believes you might walk through our door again." His hands trembled. "I miss you in a way I can't say without breaking something. I built you a fence. Never told you that. After you were gone, I built it to keep the wind from taking everything. But it still did." He paused. "Today, I met someone with your eyes. But she's not you. She's something else. Someone I think I could, if I dared, call home." Silas stood, walked to the hearth. The coals were still hot from breakfast. He opened the grate, slid the letter in, watched it curl, blacken, and vanish. A small voice called from outside Mr. Boone. Daniel, no longer haunted, no longer cautious, ran across the dusty yard and jumped into Silas's arms. "Papa," he said, laughing. Silas grunted with the catch holding him tight. "You're getting too fast for me." Miss Alara said, "I'm reading better than anyone now." "Better than me." "Way better," Daniel giggled. Alara approached a satchel full of drawings slung over her shoulder. She stood beside Silas and rested her hand gently in his. "You're letting him win again?" she teased. Silas smirked. "He's younger." Their fingers laced together without a word. He looked at her, not like a man haunted by memory, but one grounded in the present. Her eyes weren't burdened anymore. They didn't look past him. They shimmered like water does after a long storm, still and alive. She spoke quietly. "We don't belong anywhere." He nodded. "But if we're together," she continued, "that might be enough to call something home." Silas looked at the boy in his arms, the woman at his side, and the town that had never asked for explanations. He squeezed her hand. "Then let's stay." The next morning, the wind swept gently through the canyon, tugging at the dry grass as if reminding it to stand tall. Coyotes sang faintly from the far ridges. The town began to stir. Bread ovens lit, water pails clinked. Someone hammered fence posts 2 streets over. Inside their small cabin on the far end of town, Daniel sat at a wooden table, pencil in hand, scribbling letters with his tongue poking from the corner of his mouth. Alara stirred cornmeal over the stove. Silas leaned against the doorframe, his body still stiff, but his heart lighter than he'd known possible. He watched them like a man afraid to blink. Because this wasn't just a pause in the chaos. It was peace, earned not given, built not stumbled upon. And all of it had started with a knock on a door, a boy with 2 old eyes and a name Silas hadn't dared speak in years. It started with pain, but it ended with purpose. Sometimes the past doesn't return to haunt you. It returns to ask if you're still brave enough to love again. Silas Boone thought his life had ended 5 years ago, when fire and war took the woman he loved. He believed silence was safety, that solitude was survival. But then a child whispered a name on his doorstep, and the world cracked open. This story reminds us that healing doesn't always look like forgetting. Sometimes it's a matter of showing up anyway with burned feet and old wounds, and daring to choose something new. You might not get to rewrite the beginning of your story, but you can choose how it ends. And sometimes that choice starts with opening a door you swore you'd keep closed forever. If this story stirred something in you, if you believe that love can rise from the ashes of loss and build something even stronger, leave a comment. Share your thoughts. Tell us what doors you've opened. And don't forget to subscribe to Whispers of the Wild West, where every week we bring you tales of quiet courage, fierce devotion, and the kind of love that stands tall even when the wind howls loud. Until next time, ride safe.